Thank you. As a political scientist, I'd like to focus my remarks on why we should care, why Ohio citizens should care about this particular map and the process of redistricting as a whole. I'm going to focus my comments only on three principles of democracy that I think are extremely important. One of them is community representation. Another is representational fairness. And the third is competitiveness and accountability. This particular map brutally violates all three of these principles. Let me first deal with the notion of community representation and call your attention to a couple of districts on this map. The 6th district is an amazing creation, spanning 18 counties, running for well over 200 miles along the Ohio River from Portsmouth to Youngstown. It goes through agricultural areas in the interior of the state, mining areas in the Appalachian part of the state, industrial areas in the outskirts of Youngstown. What community can be represented here? Especially when you have a district which, it's been estimated, would take 6 hours to drive through by car from one end to the other. Now, this makes a mockery of the principle of representation. We could say more or less the same about the 15th district, which dips into Franklin County, where you have a significant portion of Columbus and its suburbs that are within this district, but where the overwhelming majority of the territory and voters really are quite rural, more interested in agriculture than those concerns of urban Franklin County residents. Again, trying to represent communities, trying to represent the interests of those voters who elect individuals to office is dramatically undercut. Let's move on to a second of these democratic values, competitiveness. Why do we care about competitiveness? Well, one reason is fairness. We'll come back to that in a minute. But let's deal with just some of the long-term consequences of the lack of competitiveness. Political scientists and journalists alike have, over the past decade, lamented the demise of civility and the increasing polarization of American politics. One of the factors that encourages both of these negative developments is that general elections don't mean anything in many districts. Now, when you're running in a primary, of course, you're going to be making appeals to individuals who tend to vote in primaries, and these are the most partisan, committed, and ideological voters. So typically you find that in primary elections, candidates make appeals to more extreme ideological and programmatic interests. But then in competitive districts, they're forced to move back towards the center. They need to appeal to those moderate swing voters who, in the past at least, used to determine the outcome of elections. That doesn't happen anymore in far too many of our districts, both within this state and nationwide in Congress. Why? Because the election is decided in the primary. In a non-competitive district, you will find that whoever wins the primary effectively has won the general election. What this means is that there is no reason why a candidate needs to appeal to that moderate swing voter near the middle. And indeed, from the standpoint of political parties, there's no reason why they should put in any effort into nominating moderate candidates. Instead, representing the polarized extremes has become an unfortunate consequence of American electoral politics. And that has encouraged the incivility and deadlock that we find in both, certainly, the U.S. Congress today, whose approval ratings hover around 10%, with good reason. Finally, let me try to put the representational unfairness of this map into comparative perspective. I teach comparative politics. I deal with democratic systems around the world. And therefore, I think it's interesting to compare this map with electoral systems of a number of other democratic systems. Let's focus our attention on established democracies first. There's a very simple index that we create in comparative politics to compare the fairness of representation, and that is called electoral disproportionality, or what we refer to as representational fairness. And it is simply the difference between the percentage of the seats allocated to the candidates of a given party and the percentage of the total votes won by those candidates, statewide in this case. The smaller the number, the better the plan. And we find that when we actually calculate these figures for a number of democratic systems, there are some that do a marvelous job of fairly representing the opinions and preferences of voters. The Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, Finland, Belgium, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, Iceland, all have scores of 4 or less. The United States, in the aggregate, over the period from 1945 to 1996, has a score of 5. That means the departure from the percentage of votes received in terms of the percentage of seats allocated is quite small. This is a measure of fair representation. Now, there are a number of countries that, for a variety of reasons, are biased in favor of one party or another. And when you see these, you'll find that they have scores of between 8 and 10. Greece, Spain, Australia, Britain. The very worst that I find among established democratic systems are Canada and France, and that's an artifact of the combination of single-member districts and a multi-party system. That happens only under those very strange circumstances, usually. What do we find with regard to our maps in Ohio? Well, our current map has a disproportionality score of 18, whereas the new map that was just passed into law has a representational unfairness score of 24. This is stunning. And this is the result of the fact that 51% of the voters will be electing 75% of the representatives in Congress from Ohio. That is not what the notion of democratic representation is all about. Now, this figure that you have, this graph that was presented, shows established and respectable democratic systems, those that are the model of democracy. Let's deal with, just for fun, one that no one would argue is a model of democracy. I just calculated these figures yesterday from Russia, which, as we know, has been racked with protest demonstrations about the unfairness of its elections. In the latest Duma election in Russia, the unfairness score was 7. That's actually pretty good compared to our score of 24. If one of the notions of representative democracy is that the people who are elected and seated in the legislature or Congress ought to reflect the preferences of the voters, this is a very severe violation of this core democratic principle. In short, as both Catherine and Dan have pointed out, this is a very, very bad map. This is extremely unfair to the citizens of Ohio. It violates many of the principles of democracy, and it undermines the quality of democracy in this great state. Ohio citizens deserve better.